Hello and welcome again to our conversations regarding the early church. I'm here with you, Archbishop Golphin, and my friend and colleague, Bishop Andy Lewter, is here with you again. We're going to keep discussing what we were before and just move on. Bishop?
Thank you so very, very much. And again, for those of you who have gathered, it is our hope and our prayer that this conversation will prove productive, beneficial, and widen your perspective on just how majestic the ministry and the church and the history of the kingdom of God has been over these last 2,000 years.
Now, what we've been doing is kind of giving you some perspective on where we're going with these lessons and sort of giving you some snapshots of church history. Of course, what we want you to do is to really order both our books. So you can, Bishop's book on apostles, the bishops, he gives a lot of insight, and we both have videos out there on YouTube that and on our websites that you can find out about. Order my book on the Trojan horse. We'll spend more talking about where the church is today. And I think, Bishop, I know we're fast forwarding to a lot of things. Last week, we celebrated, or a week or two ago, we celebrated Reformation Day, where everybody else was thinking about Halloween. We were thinking about the Reformation Day. And I dare say in the Western church, we are more products of the Reformation than we are of the early ancient church. I mentioned last time about how we romanced the early church. And I think in the Western church, what we don't seem to realize is that most of where we are and what we're doing, especially as far west as we are and being in the Western church, is really an influence more from being Protestant than it's being apostolic. Yeah, I would say it that way.
Yeah,
I'll let
and
you pick it up from there.
sure. And Bishop, I think what is very, very interesting and what we need to at least anchor our conversation with is that the reason the Protestant Reformation is so central and so crucial and so critical is because it is a testimony to the survival of the church. Up until that 1500 years, the church has survived. Last time we talked, I talked about how Christianity is the only member of the Jewish sectarian movement that survives the first century. Essenes,
right.
Qumarites, Sadducees, Pharisees, they all disappear. And I also want to mention this, Bishop, that by the time we get to the 4th century and the Council of Nicaea, which I imagine we'll talk a little bit about today,
yes,
Christianity had survived 2 waves of persecution. There is this the Decian persecution in the first quarter of the 2nd century. The church survived that. Then there is 185, the Diocletian persecution that the church survived. So the church has proven to be resilient, to be able to bounce back, that when it's been under assault, attack, when it had to change its identity, its connection, its affiliation, it did whatever it needed to do so that it would be around whenever Jesus decided to return. And so I find that, Archbishop, as a source of inspiration, because there's nothing that's going on today in Washington, D.C., the interruption of SNAP food benefits, a discussion now about testing nuclear arms, which we have not done as a country for the last 30 years. We have survived every ordeal, every persecution, every hardship that the church has been under. And I don't doubt that we will survive whatever hardship and burdens that we are now seeing, just as we survived the Decian persecution and the Diocletian persecution in the past.
I agree with you, Bishop. You brought up some interesting points about the persecution of the church, especially as we talk about the last one that you mentioned, the Diocletian persecution, which was pretty big. Let's talk about the church surviving those, but what came out of those. You know, 2 terms that we mention a lot that survived, that these 2 labels became a part of contention for the church, Catholic and Orthodox. The church took this position that they were going to be Orthodox around all of what they called and quote unquote, the Orthodox Church called heresies of different viewpoints of the doctrine, the early doctrine of the church. And then, of course, both groups beginning to take labels within the church that became sort of permanent labels for both of them. Eastern Orthodox, the Western Church Catholic. So let's relate around that for a minute, which comes out of these councils.
Well, one of the things that I'd like to mention, Archbishop, is that there is a tension, a divide, a conflict, so to speak, certainly a debate, a contentious debate, whereas the Church of the East placed as a priority right belief. As a matter of fact, that's what Orthodox means. It means right belief, making sure that you're believing the right thing. Whereas the Western Church had a heart and a preference for orthopraxis, where the East was orthodox, the West was orthopraxis. So the West wasn't as concerned about whether or not you believe the right thing, but whether or not you did the right thing, whether or not you practiced the right thing, and whether or not the right thing that you practiced was universal and could be found as a standard uniform wherever you went. That's why the term Catholic or Catholica was so popular. It didn't mean Roman Catholic at that time. It meant universal. In other words, it was the attempt of the church in the West to say and suggest uses are everywhere. We are universal. We are global. We are worldwide. Catholica, we are a universal church. So no longer are we confined to Alexandria and Rome. No longer are we parochial. We are universal. Now, interestingly enough, that term Catholica, Catholic, would later come to mean parochial. But initially, it was far more widespread than what it ended up becoming.
Now, I know we use a couple of terms here that some of you may not be familiar with, but some of you may be familiar with the Orthodox term because it means right belief. The church had so many viewpoints that were coming up and so many ideas, especially, and I talk about some of these in my Trojan Horse book because I talk about the various things. My whole point in my book, Bishop, was to talk about that over 2,000 years, the church's walls have not been crushed. You mentioned all these things that we have to worry about, the corruption in government now, the things that are going on, nuclear threats, the pandemic we've been through. The walls of the church have not been crushed, but it's what we open up our gates to that we have let enter into the church as what we thought were gifts that have been corrupting us and poisoning us from the inside. And so as you talk about this means of being Catholia, coming from being universal orthopraxy, where we're all worshiping and living the same way, to now becoming a parochial term or denominational term as one of the more things that set denominating where the church in the West was. This, of course, schism happened in 1054 AD because the Eastern Church decided to, it was not only just on practices, but on the languages too. Because the two dominant languages of the church became Latin and Greek. And so the Eastern Church maintained the Greek language. Of course, the Western Church was maintaining Latin as they spread west. So we see the growth of the church. And I think that what we're saying in regards to all of this and where we're going is that the church has survived. It has survived. So the only way it's not going to continue is that we have all this internal corruption, which, as you and I know, these councils was all about, to keep trying to unite the church. Let's get back to the correct doctrine and correct practice.
So, Bishop, can we share with our audience or bring about some sense of correction? Because we use this term, the fall of the Roman Empire, 476, the fall of the Roman Empire. And while that is rhetorical and it has a bit of a romantic ring, the fall of the Roman Empire, it's not historically correct. There was the fall of the West. But when the West was falling to the Goths, the Ostrogoths, the Visigoths, the Vandals, In the East, in Constantinople, you had Justin, you had Theodora, you had the popularity, the populism, and the power of the church in the East. And so, even though those of us in the West, when we look at a dark chapter in the history of the Western church, we talk about the fall of Rome. But the fall of Rome was not the fall of the empire, because the empire was still thriving in the East, in Constantinople.
I agree with that, and what because it's going to take almost to the 14th century before the East falls. So
That's
we
right.
really don't. We've got another 10 centuries, so to speak, before the East is falling. But the West has gone through its transition. We've gone through something that we call the Dark Ages. And so that whole point, as Rome falls, civilization takes a backward step. And so what they call the heathens, because they weren't Christians. And so this whole idea of forcing Christianity on those tribes and nations that they were going to picked up the idea from the Muslims coming in and in the 8th century and forcing Islam on the conquest of real estate as they went forward. So we see this whole dilemma. The church now, as the Rome in the West falls, the church is interesting. Just before the Rome falls, Constantine moves his capital from Rome, because we have, and here's another thing a lot of people don't know. There's the city of Rome and there's the empire.
The empire, that's right. That's right.
We got the city and the empire. And so the city of Rome seems to be very, very comfortable here. It was the capital. But Constantine moves his capital down to Constantinople, which made it easy for the Eastern Empire of Rome to survive. So as the Goths come into the Western Empire and invade the city of Rome, I love Augustine's book on this whole point. I love what he says in men. You have made us restless till we find our rest in you, in the city of gods. When he does that,
right, the city of God. Yeah.
I love that term. You've made us restless till we found our rest in you.
And Bishop, can I also argue, and I know this is going to be perhaps even a bit controversial, but I want to suggest and argue that part of the adoption of Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire takes Christianity, and I know we're somewhat uncomfortable with this, but it takes Christianity in a totally different direction. Suddenly, the religion of the oppressed now becomes the religion of the oppressor. And what informs that is
wait a minute, bitch. You got. I know we ain't got much time, but you got to slow up with that one.
Okay.
I think you need to say that slowly.
So the religion of the oppressed, the faith that has sustained the people who were oppressed and persecuted, what caused them to survive, how they held on to, they were using Christianity as a survival mechanism. It was the religion of oppressed people. Now Christianity becomes the religion of the people who are doing the oppressing. So the religion of the oppressed now becomes the religion of the oppressor. But here's what informs that. Because Constantine saw the church as the embodiment of Christ, and there was this age-old expectation that Christ was going to reign and was going to rule. If then the church is Christ, then the church ought to reign, rule, terrorize, and dominate, because that's what Christ was expected to do. Hello, somebody. Yeah.
That's why the church started arguing in these councils and all about the idea of state and church. So it became this idea of ecclesiastical rule and the state rule with the empire. And so as they progressed in the next 4 centuries, it became a means of seeing the state as a vehicle for the church. I know our time is out. Next time we'll finish this. So if you guys will be with us next time, we're going to finish this in episode 7.